limb over there. If you look up behind, there will be a flag, American flag. All of the people we're highlighting today have an American flag at the grave site. So if we don't go actually to the grave, you will be able to identify them. At the time this was laid out, it was 11 acres, and plots in the cemetery were $25 and $50 each. As I mentioned, the first burial is thought to be Annie Corn. She and her husband, Silas Corn, played an important part in Cameron's history. He was with the Ohio 16th Army Infantry during the Battle of Vicksburg. He was captured and imprisoned, and if you were to search his name, Captain Silas Corn, on the internet, you will find that there is a museum in Ohio that has a sword that belonged to him and several other artifacts. In 1863, he was a Confederate exchange prisoner and rejoined his regiment at Vicksburg the day that it fell into the Union, and around 1869 they moved to Cameron. The Corns are both buried together here in Graceland. Thus is the beginning of the cemetery. Again, I thank you for coming, and I hope you enjoy hearing about the people that started Cameron. And our first presentation today will be from Becky Curtis, and she is telling us about Rose Harris Dildine.
Good afternoon. I'm Rose. Nice to meet you. I had a long and interesting life here in Cameron. My closest sister and I were born on our family farm just about 3.5 miles north of Cameron in DeKalb County. My dad, Thomas Harris, and my mother, Virginia Harris, and their 2 small children had come to Cameron in 1865, a year after the end of the Civil War. They came by train from Illinois, where Cameron was still a new town. Their household goods did not arrive for 3 to 4 weeks, so they had to stay at the Western House Hotel. I'm sure that was fun. My father was one of the founders of Park Bank, which is at the corner of 3rd and Chestnut, across from McCorkle Park. Harris School, Harris Road, and Harris Community, after my maiden name, north of town, were all named after our family. There were 8 of us in Harris family. Anna, Lillian, and myself were the 3 daughters. Lily and I were born in 1865 and 1868. My sister Lillian, when she was a young adult, a bookkeeper, she helped open the Mulebach Hotel in Kansas City. My sister Anna married George Steele and remained here in Cameron to raise her family. Lillian and I, as young ladies, rode the train every day from Kansas City to work, This is where, in 1906, I met my future husband, James Chauncey Dildine. He was a young bridge builder. One evening while we were riding back the train from Kansas City is when we met. Chauncey was a son of John and Hannah Dildine, who owned a very successful bridge company in the area. His father, John, and his 2 sons, E.L., known as Leslie, and J.C., known as Chauncey, had a successful building company business. The Cameron Sun paper tells of our love story in 1955 as a story of 2 trains. And I quote, "The newspaper said it's easy to see why Chauncey would be impressed and later ask Rose to be his wife. Her eyes sparkled and she is a good conversationalist." End quote. We were married in October of 1906 for a short time when we went to Hannibal to run the business. When we returned to Cameron, Chauncey established the Dildine Bridge Company. At its peak, the company used 300 tons of steel per year. His brother Leslie had a business that he opened up in Hannibal. Hundreds of bridges in Missouri and nearby states were built out of our 2 businesses. You've seen them. Let me show you. They're the older iron overhead bridges. If you're familiar with Gridley, there was once one of these bridges near the Gridley store. Chauncey had several patterns, including one on the special bridge design. He was a very talented engineer, and in 1908 he made plans for the Kaw River Bridge at Topeka. This was one of the most difficult pieces of engineering work in this part of the country. I was so proud of him. It was 1,600 feet long and was fabricated by the Dildine Bridge Company of Cameron. Our home at 611 East 5th Street was built by my father-in-law, Chauncey's father, in 1914. We lived in this house and entertained guests there until I was 98 years old. Our house still stands today. In 1922, when the Republicans finally came in charge, that meant postmasters would be appointed by the governor. I applied to be the postmistress of Cameron, only to be surpassed by a popular petition for Judge Max R. Wiley to be the postmaster. I kept myself busy with the Eastern Star Lodge, which I was a treasurer, and participated in the Republican Women's Club. Chauncey and I never had children, but we were entertained by many nieces and nephews over the years. Along with building bridges, Chauncey designed and built mausoleums, including the Stafford Mausoleum in Evergreen Cemetery. He completed the Graceland in 1927, which is often called the Dildine Vault or Mausoleum. The Sun newspaper out of Cameron said, quote, "A beautiful mausoleum constructed of reinforced concrete along the latest scientific lines for preservation of bodies by prevention of moisture and proper circulation in manner that ensures its enduring throughout the years. It contains 50 catacombs." Did you know the presidential nominee, Herbert Hoover, came through Cameron by train in August of 1928? He was a personal friend of mine. Cameron was not scheduled to be a stop, as Herbert was on his way to his birthplace in Iowa to speak the next day. I wanted to see him in the train, and when they did a quick stop, to see if we couldn't get him to come out and say hi to us. So Chauncey and I, who were the state committee members at the time, did our best to have everybody rally at 11 o'clock at night so that when the train stopped, we could get him to come out and say hi to us. Unfortunately, when the train stopped at 11 o'clock that night, Herbert had turned in for the night. So when the Rock Island train reached Cameron at 11, his secretary had to come out and thank us for all those that came and for waiting, and gave regrets for the nominee not to be able to come out for that night. That evening, I was the recipient of a basket of beautiful flowers from Mrs. Hoover, which I handed out to all of our ladies, and a banner that I put in front of my house as a souvenir as well. There's my friend. Okay, Mr. Hoover. This was not the first nor last of my work with the Republican Party. In 1928, I was the first woman ever in Clinton County to run for legislation by a state rep. I lost by a small majority, which in hindsight might have not been a bad idea, because my dear husband Chauncey passed away at a heart attack at the age of 62 on a quail hunt north of town a few months later. It was December in 1929 and the Depression was beginning. Are you familiar with the census? I bet you are, because this year it's happening. I received many compliments while I was the superior of 2nd Missouri District of the 1930 U.S. Census. I listed myself as a seamstress living at 611 East 5th in Cameron. By 1935, my husband had been gone 5 years, and I sold the largest large building that housed the Dildine building bridge factory. The buyer, Mr. Spicer from St. Joe, raised the building. It was a really sad day for me, as many people Chauncey had employed in that area. I stayed active with the Republican Women's Club, often traveling to events in the area. In 1936, I attended a Republican women's tea at the Muehlbach Hotel in Kansas City, where I gave a talk. That evening, I attended a meeting addressed by John Hamilton, chairman of the Republican National Committee, who later became the Speaker of the House of Kansas. He presided over the 1940 Republican National Convention in Philadelphia. I had quite the adventure in 1940. It was another election year, and I attended the Republican National Convention, my third such convention. I was an alternate as delegate at large. When we nominated businessman Wendell Willkie to unseat President Franklin D. Roosevelt, my, was that a convention? There hadn't been a convention like that since 1920. No one knew the unknown Wendell Willkie at the beginning of the convention, but it was his fight and his life winning, and he won the nomination. While on this trip, I visited Washington, D.C., since it was so close. I visited the Senate and the House of Representatives, like everybody does, Mount Vernon, Arlington National Cemetery. It was lovely. I spent a few weeks in New York and had with friends I had not seen for 30 years. We took a boat trip to the Statue of Liberty and attended the World's Fair. Oh my, we attended it on the 4th of July. That was a day to visit it. Let me tell you, the British Pavilion was bombed that day. What a day that was. The crime was never solved. Despite theories, British operatives did it to draw the United States into World War II, which was raging in Europe. 2 bomb squad detectives who tried to defuse the bomb died, miraculously saving hundreds of people. When it was time to depart New York, I traveled my boat up the Hudson River to Albany, to Buffalo. I visited Niagara Falls, took a tour in Canada later, took a night boat trip across Lake Erie to Detroit, which was quite beautiful. On the final leg of my journey back to Cameron, I stopped at Indianapolis and St. Louis. What a glorious trip it was. In November, Roosevelt was elected for an unpresidential third term. Much to my surprise, in 1948, an article with photos of myself and friend Jessie Lawrence, wife of Congressman Henry Lawrence, who are buried also here in Graceland Cemetery, appeared in the St. Joe News Press. We both had received our 50-year pins from the Auto Chapter Number 17, Order of the Eastern Star. Jessie and I were treasurers for 25 years, and the paper said, quote, Rose had held many offices of trust of importance. Jessie and Rose have done much toward the growth of progress and to our city. To me, it was just like doing my civic duty. I had a good family friend who I'd known since I was a small child. Her name was Talitha Colrad. Her family ran a Cameron confectionery named as Fair Sex. I do not recall the story of why that was named that. I have no idea, but I'm pretty sure it's an interesting one. The store was on 3rd Street across from McCormick Park. It served ice cream and candies in the 1920s. Young people like to visit there all the time. When Talitha's family closed the store and returned to Indiana, she stayed with Chauncey and I to finish out her school year. I loved having someone else in our house. So imagine my joy in 1952 when Talitha came to visit me at the home on 5th for a week, 5th Street. She later moved to Costa Rica with her husband. I was so thankful for our visit. In April of 1961, my name again appeared in the paper as I celebrated my 96th birthday by going to the polls to vote. You know, I never missed voting. I had a quiet, beautiful birthday with cake and friends. My final farewell in December 1963, I passed away at the age of 98 at the Cameron Hospital, which I had been there for 6 weeks. My service was at the Poland Chapel, and I was laid to rest here in the Graceland Dildine Mausoleum. Chauncey's legacy lives on in the many bridges and mausoleums still standing in this area. Thank you. Let me give you a few small facts. 45 people are recorded here as being entombed, along with the Dildines and many Harrises, which is my family. We have found numerous instances of people being temporarily placed in the mausoleum in the winter months until weather conditions permit burial, including some who were later buried in other cemeteries. Little fact. There you go.
And if any of you would like to look in the mausoleum, we will have the door open to it. So right after the presentations, you're welcome to come over and look in. Just maintain social distancing, please. And our next presenter will be Stan Hendricks, and he is going to tell you about Jean Hills.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Becky. It was great. Hopefully everybody will get a chance to come over and see the photos before you leave. I want to tell you that it is my privilege to talk to you today about Jean Hills. When I was 11 years old, I met Jean Hills. His stone is just behind this mausoleum, just down 2 rows, and I hope you get a chance to go by there and pay respects. When I met him at 11, I just thought he was one of my dad's old flying buddies. And it wasn't until decades later that I found out just how important Jean Hills was to our community. Eugene Lysander Hills was born in October of 1892 in Kansas City. His parents died when he was very young, so his Aunt Gussie, who lived here in Cameron, took him in to live with him up here. After high school, he attended the Missouri Wesleyan College. He was part of the college newspaper staff, as well as the band, glee club, and the athletic association. By 1917, however, Uncle Sam had plans for Jean. By August of 1917, Jean had registered for military service and was soon on his way to join other Americans in the Great World War. Jean soon got a commission from the Aviation Department of the Army and began his flight training in a Curtiss JN-4 Jenny airplane at Edwards Field in Lone Oak. There was no Air Force back then. As a matter of fact, aviation in the military was just an experiment. The war ended before Jean got to see battle, but the training that he received built up a love for him for aviation that remained his entire life. By 1928, Jean was a rural mail carrier. I actually said that without tripping over my tongue. For many years, he delivered residents their mail in rural Route 7, which is just out east of Cameron. One of his other great interests was outdoor life, camping, fishing, hunting, and conservation. By the 1930s, Jean was a local scoutmaster. He organized events like fire prevention and safety programs, camping, fishing expeditions, and teaching young people principles of good conservation. He joined several outdoor organizations such as the Cameron Hunting and Fishing Club to share those activities with others. At some point he decided that taking pictures of those activities might be a good idea. So he bought some camera gear and started archiving local events. It may have just been a casual way for him to share his love of the outdoors with the club members and other social groups, but today, this may be one of the greatest contributions to the community that Jean made. Jean would shoot film and photos and slide of places and events the Hunting and Fishing Club would go. Places they visited included Bennett Springs, the the Bagnell Dam when it was first built and there was nothing else down there, the Neongwa River. Then he even took film and pictures of Watkins Mill when the Watkins family still lived there. The first Armistice Day parade in Cameron was filmed by Gene. In his film, our beloved Dr. Larry Graham marched in the high school band in the parade for the Armistice Day, while in the same parade there was a car carrying one of the last surviving Civil War veterans in Cameron. Larry's still alive, and he still calls Cameron his home, and he marched in a parade that Gene Hills got on film with a Civil War veteran. During the Centennial Parade of 1955, Gene took dozens of color slides of this once-in-a-lifetime celebration. These films and images of historic Cameron survive to this day and can be enjoyed by everyone here. Over the past 30 years, there's been a new national interest in history and genealogy. It's made these images and films priceless to researchers, historians, and even local folks who just want to know what it was like in Cameron back in those days. I had the privilege of restoring many of the old films for the Historical Society and the Depot Museum. Seeing them made me feel almost like I had been there. Gene didn't have any children, and after his Aunt Gussie passed away, he had no other local family to leave the old film and images to. So over the years, they've been kept in an archive at the Cameron Library. Now they've been digitized, and they've been digitized for the entire community to enjoy. Gene may have just thought the idea was a simple way to share his experiences with a few friends, but over time, his efforts have given our community a rare and treasured glimpse of our past. Gene Lysander Hills, he's here now, just around the corner. And every now and then I come out here and I visit him and I say hi. I say a prayer and I tell him thanks for the gift of the images he left our community. Gene Hills. Thank you.
Died in 2000. The 71 years between McElwain and Cameron came to an end. As the McElwains came to Cameron in 1929, when my grandfather, Charles Spencer McElwain, became president of State Farm Mutual Insurance Company of Missouri, which is now called Cameron Mutual Insurance Company. He was married to my grandmother, Maud Lucas McElwain, in 1900. They lived at 404 South Pine in Cameron. Both are buried here in Herbert Cemetery, right down the road here. My grandmother was active in the Cameron Methodist Church and in the Women's Society of Christian Service and in the Women's Christian Temperance Union. I retain fond memories of my grandmother's cooking and playing games with me before her death in 1958. They had 3 children, the youngest being my father, Ralph K. McElwain, who graduated from Cameron High School in 1931. He was going to Maysville High School, but it burned down in 1930, so he came down here and graduated from Cameron High School in 1931, and from William Jewell College in 1935. Upon graduation, my dad returned to Cameron and went to work for the State Farmers Mutual Insurance Company, and after serving in a variety of positions, including secretary-treasurer, he became president in the early 1960s. During my father's presidency, company changed their name to Cameron Mutual and built the new building out on 36 Highway in the year 1965. My dad met my mother, Isabel Julian, from Olathe, Kansas, because my mother and my father's sister, Mildred McElwain, were roommates at KU. I have to be careful when I say that, since I'm a Missouri fan. Anyway, after their marriage in 1949, my parents lived their entire lives in Cameron. My mother taught a variety of subjects both in Olathe, Kansas before her marriage and at Cameron High School after her marriage. They were very active in the Cameron community, including the Methodist Church, Boy Scouts, YMCA, Cameron Community Hospital, now called Cameron Regional Medical Center, Farmer State Bank, the Cameron Lions Club, the ABC Study Club, Masonic Lodge, Eastern Star, American Association of University Women, and other organizations. My brothers and I all were raised here in Cameron and all graduated from Cameron High School in the 1960s. All three of us were involved in sports and music at Cameron High School. My oldest brother Julian was an American Family Insurance agent in Grandview, Missouri. My brother Gary owned funeral homes in Macon, Bevier, and New Cambria, Missouri. My wife, the former Judy Force, and I moved to Maysville upon my graduation from the University of Missouri Law School, and we have lived in Maysville since 1972. I was a lawyer and a judge until retirement. My wife taught school both here in Cameron and in Maysville. Interestingly, we live less than a block away from the home of my great-grandfather, John W. McElwain. John W. McElwain came to Maysville after the end of the Civil War, as his grandfather and mother lived in Maysville. He served as a yeoman scout, which was a spy for the Company A of the 1st Ohio Cavalry, and his regiment was the one that captured President Jefferson Davis of the Confederacy after the Civil War. I have a newspaper account that says he received $402.89 as his share of the $100,000 reward posted by the United States government for the capture of Jefferson Davis. Our two daughters, Laura and Michelle, are the 7th generation to have lived part of their lives in DeKalb County, but curiously, none of those entire 7 generations lived their entire lives in DeKalb County, Missouri. And I learned today, just looking at the program, that my grandfather was a mayor here. I honestly did not know that. So I've learned something just by coming today as well. Do you have any questions? If not, again, thanks for the opportunity to tell you about the McElwains in Cameron.
Does anyone here remember the Ritz Theater?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I probably told some of you to sit down and be quiet in there back in the 80s. Well, A.E. Averill Earl Jarbo and his wife Frances are responsible for the Ritz. A.E. was born May 8, 1889 in Carrollton, Missouri. And his wife Frances was born November 3rd of 1894, also in Carrollton. And let's see, they had one daughter, Billy, who married Ray Davis. Billy and Ray had 3 kids, 2 boys, James J. and James F., or Larry J. and James F., and a daughter, Debbie Ann. The Jarbos also had 5 great-grandchildren. They moved to Cameron from Carrollton. They bought the Opera House on June 8, 1916. The Opera House was converted from a live performance venue into a movie theater by R.S. Stewart. And the job was to be completed by the 1st of September of that year. The original stage and curtains were still behind the movie screen when I worked there in the 1980s. The theater was a brick building. It was 39 feet wide, 90 feet long, and the ceiling height was 22 feet. And having been on a ladder near the ceiling, it seemed a lot higher than 22 feet. 500 moviegoers. So I've actually seen the place packed full. We had to turn people away. The AE, Mr. Jarbo, he asked the editor of the News Observer what he should call his new theater. And AE said, well, it's kind of ritzy. Why don't you just call it the Ritz? And so that's how the Ritz got its name. Now the first movie shown in the newly named Ritz was The Juggernaut. It was billed as a colossus of railroad drama in 5 acts. It starred Earl Williams and Anita Stewart, both ranked top 10 actors by the Motion Picture Magazine. Now, being a silent movie, there was live accompaniment provided by Miss Jessica Thomas on violin, Mrs. E. Shaw on piano, and Claudia Turner on the cello. If you would like to see part of this movie, I did find a preview on YouTube along with the final reel at the end of the movie. See, now the Jarbos had 7 movies. They had movies 7 nights a week, with matinees on the weekend, and a double feature on Saturdays. Now Saturday was a day that most people would come to town to conduct all their business, get their shopping in, visit with family and friends. So parents would drop the kids off at the Ritz and go about their business, and the kids would be entertained for a couple hours. On the balcony. Oh yes, I remember the balcony. Now, Francis Jarbo would sit in the box office and sell tickets. Wind is not being helpful today. And AE, he would collect them at the door. They employed several teenage ushers with flashlights to escort people to their seats. And Mr. Jarbo did not allow loud or unruly behavior in the movie theater during the show. He would walk up and down the aisle to discourage any such activity. And he would also be able to spot anyone who had snuck in without paying, in which he would kindly pick them out of their seats and escort them to the door. Now, I had the pleasure of meeting Mrs. Jarbo, talking with her one evening, and I was asked to escort her to the balcony and into the projection booth, and to show her all the updates we had done over the years. And taking her up and explaining it, I was doing with her. She smiled and she said, you know, I recognize some things, but there have been a lot of changes since my husband and I first started the place. So Jarbos, they ran the theater for 57 years together until Mr. Jarbo passed away. Then Mrs. Jarbo decided that it was time to pass the baton onto someone else. But as luck would have it, a couple had recently moved back to Cameron, who had gone to the Ritz as kids, and even went there on dates when they were teenagers in high school. That was Walter J. West and his wife Carol Demarest West. And I got to work for those two. But they bought the theater on April 2nd, 1973. Now, Burhead, Walter J., and his wife, Carol, they ran it until 1994, when they also decided to sell out and enjoy retirement for a change. Burhead told me that they could have signed the papers on April 1st, but he really didn't want April Fool's Day to be a omen of his first business venture. Like I said, I worked at the Ritz as a projectionist from 1978 until 1989 when I joined the Army and left Cameron. And it was one of the best experiences and most fun job I've ever had in my life. I thank you.
I have the honor today to highlight the life of Colonel Gene Pemberton. He is, you're going to find out, he's a real hometown hero. He was born in a small town, Bogart, Missouri, about 30-40 miles from here. But he spent most of his life here in Cameron as a kid, as an adolescent. In high school, he was an all-American boy. He was captain of an undefeated 1944 football team. He was the captain of the basketball team. He attained the highest rank in the Boy Scouts. He was an Eagle Scout. So he did it all. He was an all-around good young man. In 1944, still a senior in high school, he enlisted in the Army Reserve. That would have been for he decided to change and enlisted in the Air Force Reserve in 1946. He continued his education. He went to Missouri State University for 2 years. And while he was at Northwest Missouri State University, he married a childhood sweetheart from Cameron, Juanita Ford. And Juanita also was a student at Northwest Missouri State University. She got her degree and she was a music and physical education teacher. And so, in fact, she taught here at the Cameron School District for a small period of time. Gene continued his education. He transferred to Kansas University and graduated in 1950. At that point in time, the first thing he did was he enlisted into the active Air Force and became part of their pilot program. So he was a pilot from day one in the Air Force. So for the next 13 years, Gene and Juanita lived all over the world. He was stationed in Japan, he was stationed in Germany, he was stationed in Korea, and of course many Air Force bases throughout the United States. Then in 1964, he got orders to go to McConnell Air Force Base in Wichita. At that point in time, he had been flying what at that time was an F-105 Thunder Chief bomber jet. And when he got to McConnell Air Force Base in Wichita, he and a group of other pilots continued training as that jet was being used extensively in Vietnam. So from 64 to 66, they continued their training. And then he got the inevitable orders to report to an Air Force base in Thailand. And if you don't know this, in Vietnam, the jets would fly from Thailand to do their bombing missions in Vietnam. And so he was to report to a Air Force base in Thailand. He reported to that base on July 4th, 1966. Now think about that, July 4th. Now, I can just tell you that I will guarantee you he thought about some of the things he did as a kid here on that July 4th day. You just do that. But anyway, he was there. He arrived July 4th. I really was not able to find out how many missions he had flown before this last mission. 19 days. 19 days after he arrived, he and his navigator were given the mission to fly a very dangerous mission. And that was to fly into North Vietnam, search and destroy SAMs. They're called SAMs, Service Air Missiles. And so anyway, on that day in July, he and his partner took off. They flew. They did, in fact, get into North Vietnam. The weather was horrendous that day. And rather than abort, he and his partner continued Mary. I'd like to read. He was awarded a Silver Star for his actions, gallant actions, and when his body was returned, or his remains were returned, they do this sometimes. They upgraded him from a major to a colonel. So he is known as Colonel Gene Pemberton. I'm not going to read this to you, but basically what it says, the President of the United States is very proud to provide this Silver Star to this person who had done so much for our country. So, with that, that's the story of a local hero.
Your next narrator is Pat Jones. She will tell you about Marion. And I think it's a very interesting story.
It is an interesting story. He wrote a series of letters to his niece that in 1914 he published into a book at the request of friends and people in town. And I would love to show it to you, but I'm not going to because we're not going to be touching stuff. But there's a picture of the niece that he dedicated his book to, and a picture of him. I've always been fascinated in cemeteries because you see when somebody's born and when they died, there's always a dash in between. And I've always liked a dash, so I've researched it some. So we refer to the dates on a tombstone, the beginning and the end. However, what matters most of all is the dash between those years. One verse from a poem called the poem Dash by Linda Ellis says, "For the dash represents all the time that she spent alive on earth, and now only those who love her know what that little dash is worth." I'm going to learn about Marion's dash. Marion Munsell was born September 10th, 1958. He died December 21st, 1924. And now here we learn about his dash. Mr. Munsell was born in Ohio in 1866. At about 6 years old, he moved with his family to Daviess County, Missouri. About a year later, in 1967, the Munsells moved to Cameron, where they made their home for many years. I'm reading a quote from the newspaper. "Here he grew to manhood, was educated at the schools of Cameron, and also took his business training here. The 1888 census has him in DeKalb County at the age of 21. Mr. Munsell was an employee of Burr Corn, later the W.S. Corn and Company. He quit working there to start a fruit orchard business in North Cameron in DeKalb County. He did very well there. He was able to sell that orchard and went to work for the Santa Fe Railroad as a conductor on one of their Pullman cars. He stayed with them for years, and this is when he wrote about his route and his travels to his niece. It's really interesting. He did a very good job. Marion married Nanny T. Garl in Cameron in April of 1885. They had no children. For years, Mr. Munsell lived with the Garls, his wife's family, on West between Pine and Cedar. Interestingly, all the siblings and all their spouses
Well, Elmer Ellis had a sister named Pearl and two brothers, Carl and Roy Ellis. My grandpa's first wife was Pearl. They got married. She died in childbirth. My grandma, Poland, whose maiden name was Dorothy Clark, she grew up in Columbia. Her family were Clarks and Gentrys. Her mother was a Gentry. Her great-great-grandfather founded Columbia, Missouri. First mayor, Andrew Jackson appointed him first postmaster. He was a colonel in the militia, Missouri militia, during the Seminole Indian War in Georgia and Florida. He was killed in 1837, and President Jackson, Andrew Jackson, named his wife, Anna Gentry, as the first postmistress of Columbia, and I think she may have been the first female postmistress in the United States at the time. They had several children. Then my grandma went to school at the University of Missouri, graduated, came up here and taught home ec. Grandpa met her while she was teaching home ec, got married. They had 3 children. Grandma died in 1971. She's buried here. Grandpa Poland, Jesse Foster Poland, died in 72. He's interred here. They had 3 children. James Ross, who was born in 23. James Ross Poland, named after his uncle, who died in the airplane crash. Married a lady named Norma Ballinger. They lived in Cameron for a while, then moved to Fort Worth area. He passed away in 69. My father, Robert Foster Poland, went into business with Granddad at the funeral home. Jim Thompson, has the funeral home now, or the Thompson family. My dad, Bob Poland, and Jim Thompson were classmates in high school. And after Jim got out of the service in Korean War, came back, bought Granddad's half interest, and Dad had a half interest. So my dad passed away in 1968. He is interred here. And then their middle boy, my dad's middle brother, was Richard Poland. He was an attorney in Cameron for years. He died in 1976, and he likewise is interred here. There is no more room for any Polands here. The Trencher name resulted from my great-grandmother, Jenny Badger. Her sister, Ivella, married a gentleman named W.H. Trencher. They lived up in the DeKalb County area, and apparently, I don't know the background, I just know that somehow they decided to build this mausoleum together. There's only 2 Trenchards here, those 2, and the rest of them were all Poland. So that's the Poland Trenchard cemetery.
Will be our last presentation of the day, and I want to remind you that you can go down and look inside of the mausoleum when the presentation down there is over if you'd like to go in and look. And I want to thank you for coming today and helping us support the museum. The museum operates solely on donations, so your $5 donation today will go to help us keep the museum going. Thank you. And our next presenter is Howard Hackett, and he is going to tell you about the Kelseys.
Okay, I will be telling you about Herbert and Addie Kelsey, a Cameron couple. Their resting place is right down over there where the American flag is. And if you get a chance before you leave the cemetery, or sometime when it's not cold, walk over there and take a look at their headstone. In the middle of the stone at the top is a little musical symbol. And that kind of tells you that this couple apparently had something to do with music. They were, in fact, a very talented couple. And, you know, it's not unusual to find a husband or wife that are both talented. A lot of us were familiar with the Prices, the Goodwins. Well, the Kelseys here were not unlike either of those couples, except they were from a different time. So I'm going to have to take you guys back a good 100 years here to hear their story. They were actually both from this general area. Herbert was born over here northeast of Hamilton in 1877. And a couple of things said 1878. The stone says 1878. The newspaper I looked at said 1877. You know how that goes when you do research. So 1877 or 78. Addie was born up the road here in Harrison County in 1886. And her maiden name was Ross, Addie Ross. Now, if you guys know anything about the history of Cameron, you know we had a college, Missouri Wesleyan College. And they both attended Missouri Wesleyan, and they both graduated. Herbert in 1905 and Addie in 1906. And that was the same year they were married. They had 4 children. Now, Herbert, at some point, did some graduate work at Northwestern University in voice, harmony, and music history. And he started teaching here at the college pretty much right at graduation. And his first job description was director of chorus and instructor of voice. And the 1914 college yearbook, which we have some at the depot, it said he has an inexhaustible amount of energy. When he starts something, it simply has to go. He is so busy that he hates to take time to button his shoes. So notice that said button his shoes, not tie his shoes. The 1925 yearbook said this: he does big things for Wesleyan in a modest way. So he loved his job, and he was quite a go-getter when it came to his vocation. Now he and Addie both belonged to the Methodist Church, and Herbert served as choir director for a number of about 19 years. In 1924, his job description at the college changed. In 1924, his job description was Dean of Conservatory of Music. So he made it to the top of the music department at the college. And he held that position until his very sudden death in 1927. And he wasn't very old, just 49, 50 years old. And to say that his death affected this town, I think, is very much of an understatement. The Cameron Sun newspaper of that time reported his death, and apparently one morning he had a couple of heart attacks. And I pulled a couple of quotes out of that newspaper that I'd like to read. One says, "The high regard in which he was universally held made his demise a deep and sad loss to the entire community." The other quote, "Seldom have the people of Cameron received a greater shock than when the word went through the town that Professor H.C. Kelsey was dead." So this gentleman was very well known and very well respected in this community. Okay, Addie Kelsey, as I said, graduated from Missouri Wesleyan. She majored in music theory, and piano and organ were her 2 favorite classes. So he was voice, she was piano and organ. And she taught at the college until it closed in 1930. And then she had some 50 to 60 students that she taught privately. And she did that for many years. And as I said earlier, they belonged to the Methodist Church. The church being associated with the college, they had all kinds of performances that they would do there at the church. And if any of you were ever in the old Methodist church that was torn down a few years ago, they had that big, beautiful, semicircular sanctuary. It had a balcony in the back. You could get a lot of people in there. And they had operas, they had ensembles, soloists, all kinds of things. And Addie would accompany all these different productions. And she was also the church organist for about 30 years. And then after she retired from playing the organ at the Methodist Church, somewhere down the road she came out of retirement and played the organ at the Christian Church for another 10 years. Now, Addie passed away in 1979, and she was 93 years old. So she lived a good long life, and if you remember when I said Herbert passed away in 1927, sadly she outlived her husband by a good 50 years. Now, you guys might be aware that out by the swimming pool, just to the north of the pool, there's a small park called Kelsey Park. And just to the east side of the park is a street called Kelsey Avenue. And kind of in the middle of Kelsey Avenue is a big 2-story house. It's kind of trimmed in green, has green colored shutters. That was the Kelsey home. So, you know, to get a park and a street named in your honor, that's kind of a big deal. So that tells you right there what that couple meant to this town. But if you kind of take a look at everything I've told you about them, about what they meant to the town, what they did for the town, at the college when it was here, and then working together at the Methodist Church with all those things, and then Addie later on by herself with her music students and at the Christian church. This couple gave this town a lot of music and a lot of musical education in voice and piano and organ. And some of you may have grown up here like I did, and this town has been so lucky to have had all these talented couples over the years. You know, I mentioned the Prices, the Goodwins, and now you guys know the story of another very talented couple from another time, Herbert and Addie Kelsey. And I hope you've enjoyed their story. Thank you for coming out.